Joining us today on the State of the Nation, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, Head of Policy Research at the South African Institute of Race Relations. Dr. Anthea Jeffery. Anthea, welcome to the State of the Nation. So glad to finally get you on here.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm very glad of the opportunity.
And you've been making some waves with this particular book that you've written, which is called A Countdown to Socialism, and subtitled The National Democratic Revolution in South Africa Since 1994. And it is an absolute critique of this mysterious thing called the National Democratic Revolution that the ANC seems to trot out on occasion, as you know, in their speeches. We know it's there, but we don't know a lot about it. So sketch a bit of a background. What is this National Democratic Revolution that you've written about?
Right. It's an idea developed by the Soviet Union. It had its origins all the way back to Lenin's time, when he thought about the need for a two-stage revolution, particularly in all the different countries which had become colonies of great powers such as the United Kingdom. The idea was first you got them to democracy and then you took them to socialism. And so some thought was given about that transition from the point where there was a democracy or a new national government to where there was a socialist economy, because most of them were coming to independence with a capitalist economy. And this really became an accelerating focus for the Soviet Union in the 1950s, because so many colonies in Africa and Asia were then becoming independent. And so that they gave the whole concept of how do you speed up that transition to socialism a great deal of thought. And they evolved the theory of the National Democratic Revolution, that this would involve a whole series of anti-capitalist transformations or policies which would be implemented incrementally, if necessary, over many years, until the capitalist economy was so crippled that it would then be possible to argue feasibly that a socialist economy would be better instead. And in the course of those anti-capitalist transformations, you would also build the power of the state, you would build dependency on the state, and you would kind of roll back the capitalist market, so that in healthcare, for example, whereas you'd had a number of private providers, you would get to the point as we are with the NHI, where the private providers are under state control. And the private providers in time may be pushed out of business because the state will control what fees they can charge, etc. And then it will be all on the state. And the dependency on the government will extend into yet another area. And so you'll get to a point where you can de-link everybody from the capitalist economy, even for work and wages, and make sure that they are entirely dependent on a state which is enormously powerful because it owns or controls all the means of production and is in charge of all these core services and goods that people need.
Okay, and one could say that depending on which lens you look through in South Africa, the ANC are well on their way to achieving it. You could look at it through another lens and say it's been a tremendous failure on that road. Let's first deal with the areas that they have succeeded in. You mentioned national health. They're trying to ram a national health insurance bill through, but they've got fiscal problems. They literally don't have the money to do it, and they don't overly have the support to do it all the time ahead of the next general election.
I think, unfortunately, that if you look at the whole history of the NHI bill, from the time that the Green Paper came out in 2011 through to now, there really have been no changes in the ANC's thinking.
Yeah.
No matter how much credible evidence, reasoned argument is provided, they stick to the NHI concept as they developed it originally. The doctors, Discovery, various other organizations try to persuade them, and they are adamant. You say, and one of the biggest queries, of course, has been where is the money going to come from? But I think if you think about the socialist mindset, they don't care about whether the system works well. They do care that they are taking away control from the private sector and bringing healthcare under the aegis of the state. It does also give them the opportunity to try and squeeze some more money out of suffering taxpayers, because there will be a need for more taxes in order to fund the NHI. And you've probably seen that the ANC has sort of mooted that perhaps we'll have to raise 200 billion more in taxes, which is a bit of a stretch, but it could be done by raising VAT, by having a surcharge on personal income tax, and having a sort of poll tax as well. And then, of course, a lot of that money will not necessarily be used for the NHI. It will be extremely useful for the ANC to have an excuse to implement more taxes, saying we need this for healthcare. But unless we have a specific statute which takes the proceeds of that revenue and ring fences it for the NHI fund, it'll go into the General Revenue Fund. So it can be used for the public sector wages, or it can be used for the social relief of distress grant. And this is what's happened in Canada, which also has a single payer system. A lot of the taxes which are raised ostensibly for health don't actually go to health. So it achieves two things, even if it really cripples the standard of healthcare in the country. It's rolling back the capitalist market, it's giving the state control in this area, it's allowing more money to be raised from taxpayers on the basis of a new need for health. And the argument will be, particularly for those of us who are already paying to medical schemes, and the taxman knows exactly how much we're paying, well, if you could afford that much for your medical scheme, you can afford that much for in additional taxes to pay for everybody.
Right. Now, obviously, that's healthcare, and we're going to revisit quite a few of the points that you've made. The sort of main blunt instrument that is used here is cadre deployment.
Cadre deployment is enormously useful in eliminating really all the, or I should rather say undermining, all the checks and balances on executive power that are in the Constitution.
Yes.
Because if you have parliamentarians who ought ideally, of course, to be accountable to voters and constituencies, but instead they are deployed cadres who are answerable to the committee that put them in their places, which of course is an ANC committee made up some of the most serious senior ANC office bearers, then that's where their accountability lies. As James Myburgh of Politics Web put it very clearly a little while ago, it's as if you have two lines of accountability under cadre deployment. One is ostensibly to the Constitution, the law, the things it's supposed to do. The other is to those deployment committees that have put people in their posts and can take them out again if they don't toe the line. So every check and balance in the Constitution, where the institution is then filled with deployed cadres, will not work in the way it was intended to do.
Yeah, and I suppose it has to be said that every party deploys their cadres in Parliament.
But not, yes.
Okay, so and they're all answerable to their party.
No, in a UK system, they are answerable to voters.
No, but we don't have a constituency system. So I'm saying, before we make it sound like this is just a uniquely ANC thing, it's a structural issue, isn't it? That you've got cadre deployment, which works for all parties. In other words, if you and I started a party and we got 5 seats, we could decide when we set up the list who number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are, you and I being 1 and 2, 3, 4, and 5 better agree with us, or else we're just going to say, we're redeploying you and we're going to put number 6 in your place, who will agree with us.
True, and I think in the legislative context, you're right, that's where it's most common.
Yes.
But it goes far beyond
that in
South
far
Africa.
Beyond.
So into the public service, into the institutions whose independence is guaranteed by the Constitution, probably into the judiciary, though we don't have adequate proof of that yet, and certainly into other institutions in society, the media, academia, business, NGOs, and so on.
Let's talk about the judiciary, because the judiciary is playing a bigger and bigger role in South Africa. In many ways, the role between a functional and a failed state in many cases. And let's give credit where it's due. The DA has been very effective in holding the ANC to account, because many of the things they do are, quite frankly, unlawful. Yes. And that's why they keep on losing every court case. It's not because one set of lawyers are better than the other. It's just that you cannot win when you've broken the law so visibly. So what we have here is a judiciary, and there's a question about whether they're captured or not. Yeah. But and it's an interesting conversation, because judiciaries, one could recall, sadly, we can recall back in the National Party days, where you had what one would call a very sympathetic judiciary, right? Sympathetic towards the ruling party.
Certainly we did. We also had some brave judges who went against the mold. But we also at that time had a parliamentary democracy. In other words, we had no
Yes.
Bill of Rights. We had no capacity for the judges to strike down laws for being inconsistent with the Constitution. That's the great breakthrough that 1994 was supposed to achieve. And there are times, many times, when the courts do well and the Constitutional Court does well. And certainly in the context of Jacob Zuma, we can see the Constitutional Court holding the line on corruption very strongly.
Yes.
But by the time that they're ready, they've always done so on Jacob Zuma and corruption. But that is not inconsistent with the NDR, because in the end there's a risk that something like Jacob Zuma will so alienate people from the ANC that they lose the state power that they need to implement the NDR. But on the other hand, there are judgments which I talk about in the book which are important to the NDR, and where effectively the wording of the Constitution is disregarded in order to promote the NDR perspective. And that's where the worry lies.
Right. Now, we've spoken about roughly about healthcare, judiciary. There's one of the big issues with NDR is, as always, with the socialist or sort of border on the road to communism, is property rights.
Yeah.
And we know that the ANC has been quite confused on property rights, hasn't it? Because on one hand, and I see you smiling, but what I'm saying is that they've always sort of, they've never been quite clear as to where their ground is. And they were quite quiet on it until the EFF came along. And one could argue that the EFF is the mouthpiece of the ANC. So you kind of go and give this really radical thing, and the ANC says, no, we'll just dial it back a bit, but it's still going to erode property rights, right? Where do you think they stand at the moment on property rights?
Essentially where they always have stood, which is that property rights are not to be respected, but you have to act carefully. You have to erode them gradually. It's the whole idea of the NDR. You don't take a big grab, because that might actually alienate people to the point where you lose power. You take a little bit and a little bit. It's the salami slicing principle. And they have always believed in that. You look at what they have said in their national conferences all the way back to 1997, it's there. It's not as if the EFF suddenly woke them up to the fact that property rights were important or that they needed to be acting faster. The timing of the NDR had always going to be, first of all, you must consolidate your hold on power. So therefore you must make sure your cadres are well entrenched in all the different spheres, and you must start setting in motion the socio-economic interventions that in the end will be more important. But 2012, they decided to embark on those socio-economic interventions, that this was now the right time. And from then on, we began to have talk about the Constitution being amended to allow for expropriation without compensation. It took a number of years for that to develop. We also had an expropriation bill, unconstitutional, quite clearly put forward in 2008, and again in 2013, again in 2015, and now in 2020. And this time it's gone through the National Assembly, is now before the NCOP. And this time it achieves exactly what the ANC wants. It will allow expropriation without compensation. Now supposedly different from that, because it's nil compensation rather than without compensation. And then there's a sort of pretense that this makes a big difference. Otherwise it will be grossly inadequate compensation. And it will pave the way for the ANC by a second statute, further legislation, to take custodianship of land, as they already have of all water resources, without paying compensation, which now means that farmers, other big users, can have their water use licenses turned down if they don't have 75% BEE ownership. They've also taken mineral resources into the custodianship of the state, which means, again, the BEE requirements can steadily be ratcheted up to the point where you lose majority control. And then they will take custodianship. We don't know of how much land, certain land, they said in the Constitutional Amendment Bill. And it could be all agricultural land, as they proposed in 2014. We don't know how far it will extend. But again, people won't be driven off their premises or their farms or their houses the moment they take custodianship, but their ownership will end. Their vulnerability to ever-increasing requirements in order to keep their licenses from the state will increase. And this is sort of typical of the NDR. Not the big bang, but the salami slicing and taking more and more and more until increasingly the state has control over the means of production.
Now, What role does social grants and you spoke about the thing which I don't think can be in dispute is the ANC's longing for people to be completely dependent on them. One way they are achieving this is by having a country that's totally not worth investing in, even for local investors, and which has led to a critical unemployment rate with a heavy dependence on social grants. The government was given a wonderful present with COVID, where they could now convert those people into complete state dependence. What role does social grants play in achieving an NDR?
Well, I think you've made many of the key points. Dependency on the state is important. And perhaps just to reiterate what I said before, you want to de-link people from the capitalist economy. So if people are not earning in the private sector, this is much better for the NDR. Because if they are earning in the private sector, and they are skilled, the education system doesn't work well to provide that, they could reach the point where they don't want to vote for the ANC anymore. And in fact, all the opinion polling suggests that once people have a certain degree of income and education, they move away from the ANC. So there's a political purpose in making sure that they don't have the income, they don't have the education, they do have the dependency. And now, as the ANC has really made it more and more impossible for young people in particular to get jobs. And the national minimum wage was an important part of that, because, as Ramaphosa has said, employers now incur a loss when they take on young people because they don't have the skills or the experience to be worth the amount that they have to be paid. So this means that youth employment has been growing steadily up, and it's now at 60% on the official definition, which is a scary thought. That creates an opportunity for the ANC to say, we must now have more public employment. We've had the expanded public works program, we've had temporary work opportunities. What we now need is permanent jobs, which are state jobs, paid for by the state, which give people decent income, which are not just for the short term. These are jobs for life, as it were. And they're talking now about having 2 million of such jobs by 2030. And this at a cost of about 200 billion, which again is a huge amount of money, which is hard to see how they can afford it. But if they can achieve that, then the people who feel desperate at the moment because of their destitution and their lack of hope will see the state increasingly as some sort of savior and provide them with a decent job.
Now, South Africa, we mentioned the judiciary being an important factor in South African life. In many cases, you mentioned the Jacob Zuma era, where the judiciary was, at that point, felt like our last hope, and delivered by upholding the Constitution, right? They just did their jobs, to be honest.
On the corruption
on
issues.
The corruption issues. Another part of some consolation in South Africa has been the role of our private sector, right? Now, I want to talk to you about the co-option of business. There is a deployment part there, but there's also a co-option part here. That part terrifies me far more than deployment, right? So deployment, quite simply, that's usually through state-owned entities. You put some guy in charge, he runs Eskom, he does the government's bidding, whatever it is.
And you put a couple of cadres on the board.
A couple of cadres on the board. We've lived that nightmare. Right. To what degree do you think big listed companies, brand names, we use their products all the time, we say, well, at least we've got the private sector. To what degree are those directors deployed by the ANC?
I would think that many of them are not, but the bulk of them in a big private sector firm are not. But there's influence from the deployed cadres, and there's always the fear that because many of the laws are impossible to comply with, you kind of want to be on the right side of government. You want to go along to get along. And when I say they're impossible to comply with, something like the Employment Equity Act assumes that demographic representativity is the norm at every level. It's never been found to exist in any country because it ignores all the most important variables in terms of experience, age, skills, education, etc., entrepreneurial flair, and so on. So they can't do it. A big company cannot have the level of representation from the designated groups that they're expected to have and still run a sensible business. So they are not complying. They are now going to be forced to comply with quotas set by the government. But for a long time, there's been this kind of discomfort that we don't want to be looked at too closely on management control under the BEE codes or what the Employment Equity Act requires, because we can't run a sensible business and find sufficient skills to meet the government's unrealistic demand. So that immediately puts you kind of on an edge. Something like the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act did the same thing. The government took custodianship of the mineral resources beneath the ground, and then it began changing the law. I mean, that in itself didn't have to make things difficult. Botswana has a similar rule, but they have a sensible regime, because whether you get mining rights depends essentially on whether you have money and technical capacity. Here, whether you get mining rights depends on a whole lot of other empowerment obligations, which are ratcheted up all the time, which are very difficult to fulfill.
Yeah.
So it makes business vulnerable is the first thing. And secondly, they've been drawn into NEDLAC, where the idea is to reach consensus on all sorts of legislation. And I think that's a pity. I think it means that big business has too much of a voice over small business. And big business can, of course, more easily cope with very onerous regulation than small business can. And if one is very cynical, one might even think that this big business has some sort of an interest in regulation, which is more difficult for the small guys to cope with.
Well,
but that's not really that's part of what's going on in this whole complicated situation. The other thing from an NDR point of view is the need to discipline business. This big business is the main enemy of the NDR, they say it in so many words, and it is to be disciplined. You need the resources of big business. That's absolutely vital, that you should take those resources and bend them to the requirements of the revolution, the priorities of the revolution. You will be very happy where Eskom is running into difficulty if the private sector will come in and provide a certain amount of expertise in trying to get the renewable sector up, and trying to repair the coal sector, because renewables will never be reliable enough, in trying to get the transmission grid going, on which we need to spend about 200 billion rand. But they do not want business through that process to have control. So they're adamant, this is not privatization, this is just a partnership, and it's a partnership on terms set by the government.
So the NDR, you gave the roots being all the way back in 1917, I suppose, just post the Russian Revolution, and a couple of people that were bored, I suppose, or had this blueprint that they wanted to roll out in other countries. Driven heavily by the communist movement, right, which sort of had two lives. It had its first life in the Russian Revolution, and then post-war, post-colonial era when we had the Cold War. And obviously South Africa is influenced heavily by the Cold War era. In actual fact, one can see every day. I think the one thing the ANC does do every night is go to bed and pray that we could wake up back in a Cold War. That's why I presume why they're backing Russia, is so that we could be back in a Cold War, because then you've got two sides fighting over you and they're prepared to sign large checks, right? We have this weird relic of the past called the South African Communist Party, right? And it's still there, and everybody in the ANC declares fealty to communism, and they call each other comrades and so on. Is it still a thing?
It is, astonishingly. You might have seen in the sort of the intro to the book, I talked about the fact that the Soviet Union was disbanded in 1991, along with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. I think there was a sense around the world that was it. Socialism was done and dusted. It had gone. But what we found, despite the disappearance of the CPSU, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, that there were still about 100, maybe more, socialist, communist parties in other parts of the world, still bound together by the Socialist International, still a number of left-leaning academics, commentators in the media, in social society organizations, wanting to work towards socialism. Because did they think that socialism had failed? Absolutely not. And we had Joe Slovo here looking at precisely that issue and saying, no, because it was, it got too bureaucratic, it got too commandist.
Yeah.
But that means socialism was never implemented in the Soviet Union. That had nothing to do with socialism.
Yes.
Real socialism is democratic and participatory and all about human rights. And that's what socialism is going to bring in the future. So you have, as it were, this revised goal.
Yes.
We're not going to talk anymore about the proletariat rising up and destroying the capitalists. We're not going to just talk about a violent sort of world upheaval in order to achieve this. We're going to talk about how socialism can spread across the world on a democratic, participatory, human rights focused, mostly, of course, the socioeconomic rights focused way. And then in time, we will see more and more countries taking this path. And so there is, I would say that the ANC and the SACB don't see themselves at all anachronistic. They're part of a global movement which is working towards socialism on this democratic basis.
And of course, being given, I would imagine, in the last decade and a half, being given some wind in the sails by the emergence of China.
Yes, undoubtedly. And China decided at the end of Mao's life that they had to do something to revive their economy. Quite clearly, they were never going to win against the West if their economy was limping along so badly. So I think it's been a quite carefully calibrated strategy in terms of how China has had its special economic zones, attracted a lot of investment into the country, had this upsurge of wealth, which has been tremendously excited, but has also kept a level of political control, which is now being increased again. And the Western companies that came in were expected to share their intellectual property. A lot of the intellectual property was also stolen if they weren't willing to share it. So China has kind of leapfrogged up the economic ladder, sometimes in quite underhand ways. It has made it enormously powerful economically, which has also made it possible to increase its power militarily. And so I read the other day that China has far better hypersonic missiles than the US has even thought of developing, because the US thought the Cold War was over and they didn't need to worry about that kind of thing. It was focused on the war against terror.
Now, but you mentioned in our earlier discussion that where the roots come from, and it comes from the Soviet era. Chinese communism and Soviet Union communism has always been at odds. They fell out in the 70s already in viewing communism quite differently. In actual fact, one could argue whether China has ever really been communist in the Soviet Union sense. They're just odd bedfellows. Really, the Chinese sort of version of communism, it has got more to do with democracy than it has to do with economic systems.
I'm not sure that the Chinese version is strong on democracy.
I'm saying they are anti-democratic.
Yes, they're anti-democratic.
But not necessarily anti-business. And we've seen that in the last 20 years.
Yes, they certainly wanted business to thrive. They've also wanted a strong level of state control over business, and they've upped that level of state control recently. In terms of what the relationship between China and Russia has been, I think there can also be value to two communist countries in pretending to be at odds. But it's very difficult to assess that from the outside. I think if we look at it now, it's very clear that China and Russia are cooperating. They declared this great friendship between the two of them shortly before the Russia invaded Ukraine. And it seems as if China has been helping Russia in various ways, carefully, so as not to attract sanctions too overtly. But I think there is certainly, at the moment, a level of strong friendship and cooperation between them. I think in time, there will be a great jockeying for position.
Yes.
Because Russia would like to be top dog. I expect China undoubtedly wants to be top dog too.
And in that little friendship between China and Russia, South Africa's been a useful idiot, hasn't it? We've sold our position on the world stage, supporting Russia in the war, bringing along a lot of Africa. It's been quite useful for both Russia's, Vladimir Putin's aims, as well as Xi Jinping's aim, I would imagine.
Well, if one steps back a little bit, the ANC came to power in 1994 through the People's War that it waged, very much with the help of Russia. even after the disbanding of the Soviet Union in 1991, there were still the old Africa hands had been in the international branch division of the Communist Party, still able to advise the ANC on a daily basis on how best to implement the People's War, the main aim of which was to eliminate their black rivals, particularly the IFP, and so make sure that they could get the domination that they would need to implement the NDR, because that had always been the plan. From the 1960s, that had always been the plan. So when the ANC came to power, they were just acting according to what Moscow had expected of them for a long time. They would now start with the NDR, initially in the political spheres to consolidate their power, moving into the socio-economic sphere when the time for that was ripe, and very much part of looking for what they now call the multilateral world that would be an answer to the US domination that had obviously been the only thing left when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But the world has changed again in the last 30 years or so. The US has become much weaker militarily, economically. Russia and China have been building up. And the ANC would always have seen itself firmly on the side of Russia. And it's also sees great value in its relationship with China, partly because I think China has got the Brick and Belt Initiative, through which it's invested in various countries in Africa and Asia. I saw you talking the other day to Azar Jamin, and of course they're not the kindest creditors.
No.
If things go wrong, they like to take the assets which they've helped to finance.
Yeah, there's a lot of wishful thinking in South Africa. I think that China will just signs checks without any expectation of repayment.
Yes, and you know, Russia would also have invested in our nuclear industry on terms which would have been good for Russia and a few people at the top of the ANC.
But let's talk about that, because at the end of it all, what we're really talking about here, NDR is, as I read it, there's a part of it which is political. In other words, we'll keep the party in control, and that seems nice at the time when you're in the party. But in essence, what's up for grabs here is economic systems. It's all about the money, right? Nobody is doing it. The only country that seems to work purely on ideology in the world is North Korea, right? The rest of the world seems to work on what is going to give them and their people and their country the fair shake at the economy, or else people get restless and soon enough you find yourself hanging out in the sort of city square on a pole. Right, and the ANC have always been reluctant capitalists. They've been great at corruption, but they've sort of been, I suppose one could say that corruption is a great form of capitalism, right? You're just really cashing in on your position. But this is about economic systems and economic control. Now, you mentioned something earlier when we were talking about property rights, about you know, that the state would then hold those property rights. And the question that I have for you is, do you think that the ANC and the NDR is driven by the state holding the property rights or depriving the current property rights holders of that property? It's two sides of a similar coin, is what I'm saying.
There's obvious link with the one, you get the other. Are they most intent on just
what's driving, what do they wake up in the morning wanting to achieve?
Is it wanting to kind of
deprive the current owners of their ownership?
Current owners because they are seen as whites and privileged and all of that. Or I would say, obviously, there's probably a kind of schadenfreude the more you're able to achieve that. But I still think it's the ideology that requires that in the end the state must have control. Custodianship is a clever concept because it doesn't mean that you drive people out at gunpoint, as happened with the farms in Zimbabwe when they were taken. It means you leave the incumbents in place, but they increasingly work for the state on terms set by the state. Yeah? So we've seen it a little bit with the MPRDA as the empowerment requirements have gone up. So you got to the point where it was said, well, you know, you can't supply coal to Ascom unless you have 51% black ownership, which means you've now lost majority control. And that was when many of the big companies actually preferred to sell out. That's the ultimate aim. So you also need to recognize that I think NDR ideology is I think, what drives them. Complicating factors are incompetence and corruption. But at the end of the day, through the NDR, you can get an extraordinary degree of political control, something that's hard to imagine in a mostly capitalist society, where the state is the main landlord, the main bank, the main employer, the main provider of education, health, everything that you need, housing, all comes from the state. That's a level of power with the state that is completely different from a capitalist society where it's all divided among many. And at the same time, you're able to use the resources of the state that you now control directly or indirectly to benefit the party, to benefit your cadres, and particularly to benefit the very top dogs.
Okay.
So you think of the enormous wealth that was assembled by Mugabe or by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and then you can tell yourself that you're not just power hungry for political power and wealth, you're doing this for the good of the masses.
Yeah.
It's quite a buzz.
Yes. Now I want to steer this in a slightly different direction, because I want to put it to you that perhaps your book is 20 years too late, because it seems to me that even though the ANC has made many strides towards the NDR on the books, right, they've actually betrayed their NDR completely themselves, and that one should be aware of it but not concerned about it. No, I'll explain to you what I mean, is that you now have a listless state. We've got a very noisy country, right, where despite the ANC's best efforts to keep people uneducated, a large number of people have been educated. We see it in the polls. The ANC have never quite captured the hearts of South Africans. At one point they were getting close, around 2004, but they have lost that completely. So, you know, I want to put it to you that the NDR and the ANC's control of the situation looks a lot to me like if one had to do a snapshot of apartheid and one went to 1988, probably at that point the laws were probably best formed, but yet the fall was only a couple of months in the future, right? So, you know, much like the Soviet Union was probably best formed at the point that it collapsed. Am I making any sense?
I understand the point you're making, yeah.
And I'm saying that just about everything that they want to achieve is falling apart dramatically, and I'll go through them. Healthcare. NHI has become a joke, right? And with the Treasury's latest call to say, guys, we're actually bankrupt. We need to cut our programs. We need or raise VAT or raise VAT or this and that and the other. You outlined it earlier, right? This puts NHI further and further out of view. Let's just deal with that, right? Deployment. They are fighting tooth and nail because deployment is being seen as the enemy. So it seems to be a case that they've lost in the court of public opinion because they had the Zondo Commission. Property rights is now not just to try and take farms from white people, it's to take houses from black people, right? It's not as popular as it would have been 20 years ago. So what I'm saying is that as terrifying as the NDR is, right, I don't see the ANC I see them having killed it themselves, because ultimately, you know, every great bad movement sows its own seeds of its destruction. And I'd say that those seeds are busy blossoming as we speak.
Maybe we should start with the example of the NHI, because I think, of course, there's a lot of criticism of it, very merited, but there's an assumption that the ANC wants it to work, that it's important that there should be competence and efficiency in a system that works. And that, of course, is not important from an NDR perspective. What you want is the additional money, and you can get it by going to every person who's paying for medical schemes and saying you can contribute that much tax.
Okay,
and it comes to over 200 billion, and then we use it for other purposes.
Okay, but I want to put it to you this. Sorry to interrupt. My apologies for that. I'm saying that what must also go with that statement is the fact that somebody has made the calculation that the majority of South Africans are going to sit by and let that happen.
I think, unfortunately, I think we are on the cusp. And I wrote the book because I really thought that the NDR has been implemented for almost 30 years now.
Yes.
So indeed, We have reached the point where there are very many NDR laws, interventions that have been made, and the economy is struggling as a result. It really has not been able to grow, it's contracting. So it means that the disillusionment was grown. It means that there is a chance, which there never was before, that the ANC can be voted out next year. And it's very important that people should recognize that if it's not voted out, then the interventions which haven't yet been implemented, the ones that we know about, are what lie ahead. So partly you need to help people to realize that the NDR is real, because we get so little coverage of it. The ANC always talks about it in its private councils and its national conferences and so, but the media very seldom talk about it. So there's a great lack of knowledge and understanding among ordinary people. If there was more understanding, there might be more of a drive to make sure that the ANC is voted out next year. Instead, we may find that the ANC benefit yet again from its steady stigmatization and attempts to really weaken every opposition party of note that it's ever faced. So the IFP was a real rival before 1994. They could have won that first election if they had not been so stigmatized and so weakened by thousands of deaths implemented by the ANC.
And their own behaviour, let's be honest.
The People's War is intended to provoke your opponent into overreaction. The more massive, the better, because then you can stigmatize them the more. So every overt bit of violence seems to be coming from the IFP. Behind the scenes, you kill, you assassinate, you necklace 400 IFP leaders, which gets very little attention in the press, and thousands of IFP supporters who, they're traveling in a taxi from Ulundi. It gets stopped, they get taken out of the taxi, they get shot dead, execution style. It doesn't get coverage, right? But what gets coverage is the IFP overreaction. Which of course they shouldn't do, but that's what the strategy is aiming at. And then when it comes to the 1994 period, the DA initially was very weak. The moment it became more powerful, it became the official opposition, the stigmatization of the DA began, for racism in particular. There have been still a small number of instances in which DA people have been attacked, sometimes killed. But the stigmatization is so important. And every time the DA tries to get to some sort of stable coalition, not every time, because I'm mindful of Helen Zille saying that there are many coalitions that work well, but in some key ones where there's a weakness, the ANC will do all it can to exploit the weakness and break apart the coalition. And it is trying to create in people's minds a sense that the ANC is the only safe pair of hands, that if you don't have an ANC victory next year, even if it means a coalition with some of the small fry, then you'll have these completely unstable opposition coalitions, you'll have ungovernability. This was the thing which was terrifying before 1994, and this is the thing which the ANC is threatening again. So I hope very much that people will be disillusioned with the ANC and worried enough about the NDR to go out in their millions and vote the ANC out so decisively that none of these getting into bed with small fry will work. And it just is the end of the party. And then you can begin to roll back these interventions and get the economy going. Won't be simple, but it can be done if the ANC is not there.
I suppose the point that I'm making is that when the ANC gets voted out, it's not because of fear of the NDR, it's more because of the ANC's inefficiency, right, in running the country.
If people were aware of the NDR, it would be fear of the NDR that would govern them. Because if you look at Zimbabwe, if you look at Venezuela, it is terrifying what happened to ordinary people.
So, ladies and gentlemen, get a copy of this book. It's required reading for people that want to be up to speed with the South African situation and exactly what it is that what drives the ANC with some of its less successful policies. It is the implementation of the NDR. It's still, as Dr. Anthea Jeffery points out, still very much their policy lodestar. Whether it's going to succeed or not, that's up to us, the voters. Remember, we've got an important election coming up. If you're happy with the road that South Africa's taking, I say vote for the ANC if you think South Africa's on the right path. If you're enjoying stage 6 load shedding, ANC is the party to vote for. If not, there are now many credible opposition parties. Dr. Anthea Jeffery, thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation today. It's been wonderful to have you, and great book. Thank you. Very important. To everybody that's joined us, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you again on State of the Nation. Thank you.